Here's a paradox for you. It's one of those things that when you really map it out, it just creates a real headache. You have this political landscape, right? It's completely dominated by Machiavellian strongmen, military juntas, entrenched dynasties.
It's a brutal game.
A totally brutal, violent game where the currency is basically fear. And then the person who comes along and breaks a 20-year dictatorship isn't a general. It isn't some rival warlord.
No, it's someone who, I mean, if you look at it on paper, they shouldn't even be on the playing field.
Right. We're looking at a self-described housewife. Someone who majored in French and mathematics, of all things, who, by her own admission, stayed in the back of the room during her husband's political rallies. And yet, Corazon Cory Aquino, she didn't just inherit a presidency.
No, she dismantled a regime.
And became the first female president in the Philippines and in all of Asia in the process.
Which is just staggering when you think about it.
But here's the mission for this deep dive. We've got this whole stack of sources in front of us. Biographies, economic data from the 80s, constitutional texts. We really want to move past that St. Cory image, the yellow ribbons, the peace signs.
It's the iconography.
Exactly. We need to figure out how she actually governed. Because what the sources really suggest is that winning the revolution might have been the easy part.
Oh, compared to what came next. Absolutely.
Yeah.
The governance part is where the story gets incredibly gritty. I mean, you're talking about a brand new government trying to survive constant military coups, a totally bankrupt treasury.
And natural disasters that just felt biblical in scale.
Yeah, it was one thing after another.
So let's try to strip away the mythology and actually look at the mechanics of this takeover. Because to understand her presidency, you first have to understand the specific kind of elite she came from. The word housewife feels like a bit of a marketing term, doesn't it?
It was an incredibly effective political brand, but you're right, it wasn't the whole truth. Maria Corazon Simulang Cojuangco was born into, well, the 0.1%. The Cojuangcos and the Simulangs are essentially Philippine royalty.
We're talking massive landowners.
Massive. And political heavyweights. Her father was a congressman, a major businessman. Her grandfather was in the historic Malolos Congress. This is a woman who grew up completely fluent in the language of power.
And as we said, literally fluent in French.
Right. And she was brilliant academically. Valedictorian in grade school, attended these finishing schools in Philadelphia, New York, and then graduated from the College of Mount St. Vincent. But look at her major.
French and mathematics.
French and maths.
That is such a fascinating combination. It's logic and linguistics. It's not the degree you get if your plan is to just, sit around.
No, it tells you something about how her mind works. She wasn't just, culturally refined. She was rigorous. It speaks to a very structured, logical way of thinking. But for the first part of her adult life, she completely submerged that.
Right.
She married Benigno Ninoy Aquino Jr. in 1954. And he was the superstar. The youngest governor, the youngest senator. He was the one who was destined for Malacañang Palace.
And she was the logistics manager behind the scenes.
Oh, essentially, yeah. She raised 5 children. She hosted his political allies. And there's this really telling detail in a couple of the biographies. She would intentionally avoid the stage during his rallies.
She wanted to be in the audience.
She preferred to stand at the back with the crowd. She just did not want the limelight.
But there's this little nugget in the financial records that people often miss. She sold a portion of her own inheritance to fund Ninoy's campaigns.
Which is a crucial detail.
It's huge. She wasn't just a passive observer. She was a financier. She was a silent partner in the entire enterprise.
It shows she was a partner in the ambition, just not the public face of it. But then that whole dynamic shifts, and it shifts violently. In 1972, Ferdinand Marcos declares martial law.
And Ninoy is one of the very first people arrested.
Thrown in prison. And just like that, Cory's life of hosting parties and raising kids in the suburbs is completely over.
This is where the housewife really enters the crucible.
It was 7 long years of incarceration for Ninoy. And Cory, she adopted this life of self-denial. The sources detail how she stopped buying clothes, she stopped going to beauty salons.
She even stopped her kids from going to parties.
Yeah, it was an act of solidarity, a private protest. She was hardening herself for what was coming.
Which prepares her for the big catalyst. Eventually, the family is allowed to go into exile in the U.S. for Ninoy's medical treatment. They have about 3 years of peace, of normalcy in Boston. But Ninoy decides he has to go back.
He knew the risks. He had to know. So in 1983, he flies back to Manila. he steps off the plane.
And is immediately assassinated on the tarmac.
That image of him in the white suit lying bloodied on the tarmac, I mean, that changed everything.
It just broke the dam of fear. And when Cory returned to the Philippines to lead his funeral procession, 2 million people showed up.
2 million?
That was the data point the opposition needed. They suddenly realized the traditional politicians, the old guard, they couldn't unite the country.
Only the widow could.
But she resisted. She really did not want the job. It actually took a petition with 1.2 million signatures to finally get her to agree to run.
And this was for the snap election Marcos called in late '85.
He thought he could catch the opposition off guard. And this campaign, I mean, looking back at the transcripts of what Marcos was saying, it was just incredibly nasty.
It was a classic authoritarian playbook, right? He framed it as democracy versus communism, trying to link her to insurgents. But then he leaned so heavily into misogyny.
Oh, yeah. He called her just a woman. He said women's talk should be limited to the bedroom.
Which, looking back now, was such a massive tactical error.
A huge one. Because Cory used that logical, that math mind we were talking about. She just flipped the entire narrative. She stood up and admitted, yes, I have no political experience. But then she immediately followed it up with,
but I also have no experience in lying, cheating, or stealing.
It was a knockout punch. She turned her lack of a resume into her primary asset. She wasn't a politician, which meant she wasn't corrupt.
Exactly. The whole thing became a referendum on moral authority. And when the election finally happened on February 7th, 1986, the machinery of the dictatorship tried to crush that authority with just blatant fraud.
The government parliament, the Batasan Pambansa, they declare Marcos the winner. But the independent watchdog, NMFREL, their numbers showed Cory winning.
So you have two different results, and the country is on a knife's edge.
But then you have this one scene that feels like it belongs in a techno-thriller. The computer technicians.
The walkout at the PICC, it's such an incredible moment. You had 30 computer technicians from Comelec, the official election commission, and they're watching the raw data come in from the provinces.
And they can see it.
They see the numbers being manipulated in real time on the back end to favor Marcos. And in this moment of just insane bravery, they all just stand up and walk out in front of the press.
That's the emperor has no clothes moment right there.
It confirmed the rig for the entire world to see. So Cory calls for a massive civil disobedience campaign. She holds a rally, the Tagumpang Bayan, or People's Victory Rally. 2 million people show up again, and she tells them to boycott the crony companies.
The banks, the media, even the soda companies owned by Marcos's allies.
She hit them right in the wallet.
And that economic pressure, combined with the moral outrage from the walkout, finally cracks the military. Her defense minister, Juan Ponce Enrile, and the vice chief of staff, General Fidel V. Ramos, they defect.
They hole up in the military camps along the main highway, EDSA, and they basically dare Marcos to come and get them.
And this is where the Catholic Church steps in. Cardinal Sin gets on the radio and appeals to the faithful, telling them to go to EDSA to protect the rebels.
And millions show up. They face down tanks with flowers and rosaries. It was this massive, nonviolent demonstration that just froze the military. Marcos realizes he can't shoot his way out of this without a massacre, which the U.S., his main backer, would never support.
So it all culminates on February 25th, 1986. Cory is sworn in as the 11th president in one part of town. About an hour later, Marcos holds his own inauguration.
But he flees to Hawaii that same day.
The dictator is gone. And this is where the movie usually ends, with the credits rolling.
But for us, this is where the deep dive really begins. Because now she's sitting in Malacanang Palace, the confetti has all been swept away, and the country she's inherited is an absolute wreck.
And wreck might be an understatement. She inherits a bankrupt nation, a divided military, multiple insurgencies. But her first move is so bold, and it's one of the most interesting constitutional maneuvers in modern Asian history. She issues Proclamation Number 3.
The Freedom Constitution.
That's right. To restore democracy, she effectively declared a revolutionary government. She abolished the 1973 Marcos Constitution, she dissolved the rubber stamp parliament, and she fired every single Marcos appointee.
All the way up to the Supreme Court.
All the way to the top.
Wait a minute. So to fix the dictatorship, she had to assume dictatorial powers herself.
That is the central paradox of her first year. For a short time, she held both executive and legislative power. Her argument, and the argument of her legal team, was that the existing system was so poisoned, so booby-trapped by Marcos, that she had to bulldoze it to build a new foundation.
You couldn't just, operate the old machine. You had to scrap it for parts.
A very hard reset.
Huh?
But, and this is the absolute key difference, She immediately used those absolute powers to draft a new constitution that explicitly stripped her of that same power.
The 1987 Constitution.
Which restored the bicameral Congress, limited the president to a single 6-year term with no re-election, and installed a massive Bill of Rights. She was effectively using absolute power to make sure no one could ever have absolute power again.
Which is incredibly rare. Usually when people get that kind of power, they find very good reasons to keep it.
Exactly. And she also pushed through the Local Government Code of 1991, which was another huge deal. It devolved power from the national government in Manila down to local units. She was deliberately dismantling the centralized power structure that Marcos had perfected.
Okay, so that's the legal and political cleanup. But the economic cleanup, that seems like a much, much messier job. The numbers in these reports are just staggering. Foreign debt went from, what, around $3 billion in 1970?
To $28 billion by the time Marcos fled.
$28 billion. And the treasury was empty.
Completely empty.
Yeah?
So Cory's government faced this binary choice, and it's one that economists still debate today. Option A was to repudiate the debt, basically say, the dictator stole this money, the Filipino people didn't benefit from these loans, so we aren't paying it back.
Which is the moral argument, right? Why should a rice farmer in Luzon have to pay for a loan that went into some Swiss bank account or a failed nuclear power plant?
Precisely. And the political left was screaming for this. They wanted a clean slate.
Yeah.
But Cory and her economic team, they took option B. They chose to honor all the debts, every single cent.
Even the unjust ones.
Even the fraudulent ones.
Why? I mean, that seems like political suicide. You're basically taking money away from schools and hospitals to pay foreign banks for loans your country never even saw.
It was a cold, pragmatic calculation. Her team argued that they had to restore the Philippines' international credit reputation. They feared that if they defaulted, the country would become a pariah to the global banking system.
No more trade financing, no development loans, total isolation.
Right. She chose what she called honor, to keep the credit lines open for the future.
So she sacrificed short-term welfare for long-term credibility.
Yes. And the cost was incredibly high. For her entire 6-year term, huge chunks of the national budget went straight to debt servicing, just paying the interest. It hamstrung her ability to build infrastructure or fund social services. It's a major reason why the poverty numbers remain so stubborn and why, people started to get frustrated a few years in.
She did try to go after the stolen money, though, right? The PCGG.
She did. She established the PCG, the Presidential Commission on Good Government, to hunt down the billions in ill-gotten wealth. And she also dismantled some of the huge crony monopolies in the sugar and coconut industries.
And the economy did start to recover, didn't it?
It did. The economy grew at an average of 3.8% during her term, which is decent, and inflation dropped significantly. But that debt service, it was a constant anchor around the neck of the recovery.
And speaking of frustration and poverty, we have to talk about land reform. This was supposed to be the centerpiece social program of her entire administration, CRRP.
The Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Law. This is probably the most glaring contradiction of her presidency. The goal was so noble, to finally break up the old feudal estates and give land to the tenant farmers who worked it.
Which, in a country that was still semi-feudal in many areas, was seen as the key to ending rural poverty.
It was the silver bullet.
Yeah.
But Cory came from the landlord class.
The Cojuancos owned Hacienda Luisita, a massive 6,453-hectare sugar estate.
One of the biggest contiguous estates in the entire country. So you have this situation where she's passing a law to redistribute land, while her own family owns a massive chunk of it.
That's a huge conflict of interest.
And when the law was finally passed, it contained a critical, some would say fatal, loophole. It allowed corporate landowners to use something called a stock distribution option.
Okay, what does that mean?
Instead of giving the farmers the actual dirt, the land titles, the corporation could give them shares of stock in the company that owned the land.
Oh. So farmers get a piece of paper, and the family gets to keep the land intact.
Basically. And Hacienda Luisita used that option immediately. It allowed the Cojuanco family to maintain control of the estate. And to the critics, especially the peasant groups who had marched and fought for this, it felt like a total betrayal.
It looked like the president had rigged her own signature program to protect her own family.
It really punches a hole in the St. Cory narrative. It shows the limits of her revolutionary zeal when it bumped up against her own class interests.
It does. And that kind of disillusionment, it fueled the instability. Because while she was battling economists over debt and landowners over reform, she was also literally battling for her life, the coup attempts.
The list here is just exhausting. I mean, the sources say numerous coup attempts,
Depending on how you count them, there were somewhere between 7 and 9 serious attempts between 1986 and 1990.
And the incredible irony, they were led by some of the same guys that reformed the Armed Forces Movement, or RAM, who had helped put her in power during the EDSA revolution.
So why did they turn on her so quickly?
It seems like a case of buyer's remorse. They didn't want a liberal democracy. They wanted a military-guided junta. They saw Cory as soft on communists because she released political prisoners and tried to negotiate peace.
They wanted to save the queen from her own leftist advisors.
It's a classic Praetorian Guard mentality. And it created this terrifying environment for governance. I mean, imagine trying to court foreign investors, and every 6 months or so, there are tanks rolling down the main highway in your capital city.
It would just kill any economic momentum. The 1989 coup attempt was particularly bloody and damaging. It actually required U.S. air support from Clark Air Base to help suppress it.
And that shattered the illusion of stability. It sent the economy into a dip.
And amidst all this military posturing, the government lost a lot of its moral high ground with the Mendiola massacre.
January 1987. This was a true tragedy. Thousands of farmers marched to Mendiola Bridge, which is right near the presidential palace, demanding genuine land reform, no stock options, real land. The Marines opened fire.
12 people were killed, over 50 injured.
For an administration that was built on the principle of people power and nonviolence, that must have been just devastating.
It was a turning point. It caused her own human rights commissioner, the legendary José Diokno, to resign in protest. It led to the collapse of peace talks with the communist insurgents. It showed that the state apparatus was still capable of brutality, regardless of who was sitting in the president's chair.
And speaking of conflict, she was also dealing with the long-running Moro insurgency in the south.
She tried to make peace there, too. She famously went down to the island of Jolo and met with the MNLF leader Nur Mizwari, which was a very brave move.
It led to the creation of the ARMM, the Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. It was a genuine step toward autonomy. But a splinter group, the MILF, kept fighting. And terrifyingly, this was the period when the terrorist group Abu Sayyaf was founded, around 1989.
So you've got political instability, constant military rebellion, economic stagnation from the debt.
And then the universe just decides to pile on. Section 7 of our notes here is just titled Acts of God.
It is genuinely difficult to believe the sequence of events happened to one administration in such a short time.
It starts with the MV Doña Paz in 1987. A passenger ferry collided with an oil tanker.
The death toll was just horrific.
Over 4,300 people died. It is still the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in recorded history. Worse than the Titanic. It was a massive national trauma.
And then the earth itself starts shaking.
The 1990 Luzon earthquake, a magnitude 7.8, just flattened cities in the north like Baguio and Cabanatuan. And then the big one, Mount Pinatubo in 1991.
A volcano that everyone thought was dormant.
It hadn't erupted in hundreds of years. When it finally blew, it was the second largest terrestrial eruption of the entire 20th century. It buried central Luzon in volcanic ash.
It destroyed the agricultural heartland, and strategically, it completely buried the U.S. Air Base at Clark.
Which sort of forced the issue on the whole American military presence.
Right, that was another massive headache she was dealing with. The Philippine Senate, driven by nationalism, wanted the U.S. bases out Subic Naval Base and Clark Air Base. They saw it as an issue of sovereignty.
But Cory initially wanted them to stay.
Why?
Pragmatism, again. She was worried about the thousands of Filipinos who worked on those bases and the economic impact of them leaving so suddenly. She even led a protest march to try and convince the Senate to keep the bases.
The president protesting her own Senate.
Exactly. But the Senate voted to eject them, and then Pinatubo erupted and basically sealed the deal for Clark Air Base.
The Americans left. But there is one man-made disaster from this period that I think, for many people, defines the daily experience of the late Cory years even more than the volcano. The lights went out.
The power crisis. This is a classic case of good intentions leading to really bad outcomes. Early in her term, Cory's administration decided to mothball the Bataan nuclear power plant.
This was the big controversial plant built by Marcos.
Yes, it was riddled with corruption issues and, worse, major safety concerns. It sits near a fault line and a volcano. So, deciding not to turn it on was arguably the safe, moral choice.
But there's a but?
The big but is that the administration failed to build a replacement energy source. They completely underestimated the growing demand for electricity. They didn't ramp up coal or geothermal or anything else fast enough.
So by the end of her term...
By the end of her term, Manila was experiencing 7 to 12-hour blackouts every single day.
There was a bitter joke at the time. Cory magic. Now you see
Yeah.
the light, now you don't.
It was brutal. It decimated small businesses. You can't run a factory or a restaurant or even small shop without power. It just soured the public mood completely right at the end of her term. People were exhausted.
So we get to 1992. She's tired. Her popularity has taken a serious hit from the blackouts and the instability. Her advisors come to her and say, hey, technically you weren't sworn in under the 1987 Constitution. That one-term limit doesn't apply to you. You can run again.
And this right here is the moment that I think secures her legacy. She says no, absolutely not. She understood that the single most important thing she could do for the future of Philippine democracy was not to fix the power plants, but to step down.
To show that power can be transferred peacefully, that the system works.
She endorses Fidel Ramos, the general who stuck by her during all the coups, and he wins the election. And there's this one detail about her last day in office. She rides to the inauguration in the presidential Mercedes.
But after the ceremony.
After the ceremony, she leaves in a plain white Toyota Crown. No entourage, no security detail, just a citizen driving away.
That is such a powerful visual. But she didn't exactly retire to a rocking chair, did she?
No, not at all. She became what people call the guardian of democracy. She would show up whenever she felt that democracy was being threatened. She actively campaigned against charter change attempts by later presidents, like Ramos and Estrada, to change the Constitution to extend their term limits.
And she was instrumental in the EDSA to a second movement, which ousted President Joseph Estrada in 2001.
She was, though interestingly, the sources note that she later apologized to Estrada for her role in that.
That's fascinating. Why?
It was a very nuanced apology years later, in 2008. She basically admitted that while she felt his ouster was necessary at the time because of corruption, the extra-constitutional nature of it, using street power to remove a leader again, had negative long-term consequences for the rule of law. She recognized the double-edged sword of people power.
She was always watching, always reevaluating. She even called for Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo's resignation in 2005 over election rigging allegations. She never really left the stage.
And then the end came. She was diagnosed with colorectal cancer in 2008, and she passed away on August 1st, 2009.
And the reaction from the public?
It was like 1986 all over again. All the cynicism about the blackouts and the coups and the compromises just seemed to fade away, and people remembered the symbol. The yellow ribbons came back out everywhere. She had declined a state funeral. Her family wanted a private one, but the public just turned it into a state event anyway. Hundreds of thousands of people lined the streets for her funeral procession.
So when we synthesize all of this, the math major, the housewife, the widow, the revolutionary president, what is the final takeaway? Because it's clearly not a clean success story.
No, it's not. Not at all. If you look at the metrics, GDP, infrastructure, poverty rates, her scorecard is average at best, maybe even below average if you factor in the power crisis.
Yeah.
But you look at the institutions, it's a completely different story.
Awesome.
She inherited a country where the press was silenced, Congress was a sham, the Supreme Court was in the dictator's pocket, and elections were a joke. She left a country where all those institutions, for better or worse, were working again.
Noisy, messy, often gridlocked, but working.
She rebuilt the container for democracy, even if the contents were still chaotic and often disappointing. I mean, democracy is inefficient. An authoritarian government can build a bridge just by ordering it done. A democracy has to debate it, bid it out, and vote on it. The blackouts, the instability, the slow pace of recovery, in a way, those were the price tags of the transition.
Which leaves us with a really heavy thought to wrap this all up. We love the stories of revolution, the walkouts, the human shields on the highway, the dictator fleeing in a helicopter. That's the movie version.
But the Cory Aquino story, when you really look at it, asks a much harder question. Is restoring democracy actually more difficult than fighting for it?
It's so much easier to unite people against a common villain.
It's incredibly hard to unite them for the boring, painful day-to-day work of paying off old debts and drafting local government codes. The revolution doesn't end when the confetti falls. That's just when the real work begins.
And sometimes the person who wins the war is the one who has to sacrifice their unpopularity just to survive the peace.
A complex legacy for a truly complex figure. That is our deep dive on Corazon Aquino. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next one.